Got the questions. All righty. So welcome everyone. As we continue to filter in, I'm just going to let you all know a little bit about what we're up to today. And then I will introduce Dr. Coho, and he will go ahead and introduce Dr. Connell. So my name is Gabriel. I am the Assistant Director at the Denver Project for Humanistic Inquiry. And we love to learn from some of the greatest minds of our time and share that knowledge and expertise with all of y'all in a situation where we can ask questions and really engage in some discussion with these folks. So today we're going to be focusing on Aristotle, his ecology, agriculture, and sustainability. I'll read a quick overview of today's event. So Aristotle declares that animals are for the sake of human beings in his Politics. This supports the influential anthropocentric interpretation of his teleology. However, Aristotle's zoological works focus primarily on the good for each type of animal. This paper explores a midway position between the overarching anthropocentric and biocentric readings of Aristotle's natural teleology. He does so by bringing to light many discussions in both his zoology and anthropology, which explain the interrelationships between animals and their environments. There are also accounts of numerous interspecies interactions, both combative and cooperative. In this context, although humans are superior in Aristotle's view, other living beings clearly have their own aims and goods, which humans must manage and respect. So we will have plenty of discussion material coming up. If you do enjoy today's events and would like to find out more similar things that we're doing, for example, next week we have an event on the politics and philosophy of punk music. Please join us at dphi.org. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Coho. Caleb Coho is the chair of philosophy here at MSU Denver, and also, of course, a professor. He's going to go ahead and introduce our speaker today. And all right. Thanks for y'all for being here, and thanks, Dr. Coho.
Yeah, thank you. We're delighted to have you all. Originally, we'd hoped to do an in-person event, but Denver weather didn't cooperate. But now there's an opportunity to share it with a broader international audience. So I'm delighted to have Professor Sophia Connell with us. She's done a lot of excellent work on Aristotle's biology, both writing a book on female animals and editing the Cambridge Companion to Aristotle's biology. And today's question is really important. As Aristotle's often seen as the father of biology, but he focuses on individual species, and a lot of scholars think he just doesn't have any view or not much to say about ecosystems or broader interactions between different kinds of animals and plants. And there's also a question about whether Aristotle relates everything back to humans and whether biology is sort of started in this very anthropocentric way or there's something more there. So we're delighted to have Professor Connell, who will be addressing those questions, and then we should have some time for a lively discussion. So Professor Connell, thank you.
Thank you very much. So I hope that you have the handout because it has basically my talk sketched out and some passages that I'm going to be reading out from Aristotle. And as Caleb said, this talk is really trying to locate some ideas about ecology in Aristotelian biology. By ecology, I'm thinking of plants, the interactions between plants and animals and their environments. And usually it's thought that Aristotle didn't have an interest in anything like that, that there is, some scholars say there's just no ecology at all in Aristotle's writings or in his philosophy. But as I was researching recently the possible relevance of Aristotle and Aristotelian ethics in contemporary environmental ethics, I started to wonder about whether he had any ecology. And what I discovered was that he definitely has something to say about the interaction between different animals and their environments, but it's underdeveloped or it's undeveloped. So it's sort of embryonic. And there are good reasons for this, partly because of the sparsity of information that he had, and that a lot of his information came from agriculture and from people who are experts in taking care of domesticated animals. And so when I say he had a kind of embryonic proto-ecology, that means that in my research, I've had to bring together different texts to find this ecological awareness in Aristotle, which I also signal as a view about sustainability. And there's only really one tiny fragment of that in his work. But before I go into that in more detail, as with a lot of issues in Aristotle, you have to clear the ground of, hundreds of years of scholarship that have set things up in a particular way to make us think that there's no ecology in Aristotle. And I see that has happened as a reaction against stoicizing readings of Aristotle's sort of metaphysics of living beings. And these stoicizing readings decide that the world is structured for the ends of human beings, that it's got a providential structure, like the Stoics thought of it, and that humans benefit from the way the world is structured, that it's all organized and mapped out, and all of the parts fit together. And the kind of reaction against that from people who've read Aristotle's zoology is that that's not what we find when we start reading his zoological works. Instead, we find an emphasis on the individual organism. So an individual organism is trying to survive. It's trying to thrive. You're focused on the animal as the kind of animal it is, sort of almost detached from any of its environment. So that was the kind of what I call the biocentric response to the stoicizing reading of Aristotle. Now, one reason why you get this stoicizing reading is that there's just this one passage where Aristotle explains human relationship to animals and plants, and that's in the context of his politics, where he's explaining how human beings have to use their environments in order to survive and thrive. And he also has to take on board all the information that he's getting from people who are experts in agriculture and animal husbandry. So in that context, he's very much sort of coming from the perspective of humans and how they use other animals and plants. And in that sense, then, he is aware of all of these ways in which humans manipulate the environment and use animals and plants for their own benefit. And he actually doesn't worry about, he doesn't say, oh, we need to justify that. He accepts it. He thinks about it as a good thing in a way, as we'll find out. There are lots of different goods competing in his picture, so it's not the only good thing, because these animals and plants have their own goods. But as I said, he does say, though, that we shouldn't just use animals and plants in our environments in any old way, willy-nilly, as much as we want. We have to restrain ourselves in some ways and use resources in an intelligent manner. And so, starting, I thought, thinking about his ecology, that there's a midway position between the stoicizing overarching system of the universe and this focus on individual organisms. And so I'm trying to find a middle way interpretation of Aristotle. And basically what that amounts to, it's quite simple in a way. It's that animals use other animals or plants, organisms, for their own benefit. And that's how those things are for their sake. But from that animal, from the perspective of the organism that's being used, it's not for their benefit. It's incidental to their own ends. So you've got kind of primary and secondary teleology. And in terms of the background conditions, like what does the environment look like? The inanimate environment and the animate environment. So the earth, air, fire, and water around the animal, and then the other animals and plants around the animal or plant. What's going on there? What I find are descriptions of mainly of combative relationships, predator and prey. The predator's body is set up to pursue and to be aggressive, and the prey's body is set up a defensive to run away or to defend themselves against this predation. So that's the sort of thing. There's occasional bit of cooperation, but not a lot. It's quite a combative kind of picture, which isn't very providential. Okay, so I'm going to begin with this section on, so what do we have to do, first of all, is to find a place for ecology in Aristotle's thought, because it has been denied by various thinkers. Most recently, Spiros Rangos in 2021 paper, says there's no place for ecology in Aristotle's thought. And this, as I said, is, I believe, a quite extreme reaction against the Stoicizing reading. So let's have a look at the Stoicizing reading and what it's based on, and then we'll see how the reaction worked and what it put in place that we can then sort of build some ecology out of. So the Stoicizing perspective sees an overarching system of the cosmos which controls all the interrelationships between entities, including animals and plants. And then you throw in anthropocentrism. So all of that is for the benefit of human beings. And how do they get this reading? From two main passages, both of which I'm going to read out. And they're not the easiest passages to understand, but we will be going back to them. The first is from Aristotle's Metaphysics, book Lambda, where he's speaking about the unmoved mover. And the second passage is the famous one from Aristotle's Politics. So first of all, from the Metaphysics, he says, we must consider in what way the nature of the whole possesses the good and the best, whether this is something separate and itself by itself, or its arrangement, or is it both ways, like an army? For its being well is in the arrangement and is the general, and especially him, especially the general. For his is not because of the arrangement, but the arrangement is because of him. Everything is arranged together in some way, but not in the same way, fishes and birds and plants as well. And they are not in such a condition as to have no relation to each other, but there is some relationship. For everything is arranged together in relation to one thing. But as in a household, those who are free are least able to do whatever is by chance. But all or most things are arranged, whereas slave and beast are able to do little toward what is common, but for the most part do whatever is by chance. For nature is this sort of principle for each of them. And then there's the passage from the Politics. Here the ways of life, bios, the ways of life for the human are the nomadic, the agricultural, and those of raiding, fishing, and hunting. Some people live agreeably by some combination of them. Such acquisition is clearly given by nature to all. And here he notes that eggs have some nutriment in them, and that certain animals are supplied with milk from their mothers. And so that's nature providing food for animals. And he says, so similarly, it's clear we have to suppose that plants exist for the sake of animals, and that other animals exist for the sake of humans, tame ones both for use and for food, and most but not all wild animals for food and other support, in order that we may obtain clothing and other tools from them. Now, the Stoicizing reading that puts those two together finds a providential order in the cosmos, which is aiming towards human ends, is then resisted by what I call the biocentric response. In his natural science, especially in his zoological works, Aristotle concentrates on individual organisms striving to live out their lives successfully. And we have several basic axioms from this perspective about individual organisms. And the first one is from the Physics, where Aristotle says, I'm looking for the good because looking for the ends, the things that natural objects drive towards, not simply, but in relation to the being of each thing. So we're thinking about individual substances and what they are striving to do as individuals. And then there's this other idea of nature does nothing in vain. And again, that's directed towards individual organisms and not some kind of overarching nature. And as Alan Gotthelf put it, the best in question always relates to the life or the being of the animals, so the individual animals. Okay. So how are we going to resist these? Well, how are we, if we find this in the zoology, how can we read the passages that we've just read through at the beginning, from the metaphysics and from the politics, to undercut that overarching conclusion, a conclusion that nature has this overarching structure? Well, let's first look at the metaphysics and physics of Aristotle. The first thing to note is that Aristotle rejects the idea that the entire cosmos has a soul. This is in the Orphics and in Plato. From the Timaeus, the world has a soul as a living being. And one of the reasons he rejects this is because he says the world can't be a substance. The entire world is not structured like an animal. It's not a substance, because you can't have a substance which contains lots of substances. And all these animals and plants are individual substances, and they exist in the whole world. So you can't have, the parts of the substance can't be substances themselves. So here's a good reason why the whole world doesn't have a soul. So if the whole world doesn't have a soul and isn't like an organism, then why is it in the metaphysics he says that this whole, like the whole cosmos, the whole world, topan, is ordered to one end like an army or a household? Okay, well, we'll come back to this, but there's something else to throw in here on the side, or possibly on the side of the anthropocentric reading, which is that if we have this order in the cosmos, it includes the kind of weather systems, the way the stars go around the Earth, and all of those systems. If they are if you're going to take the Stoicizing reading, then you're going to believe that all of that is for the sake of humans as well. And where you can go to get another clue about that, they say, is this really exciting and controversial passage from the Physics, from Aristotle's Physics, Book 2, where it's called the rainfall example, and you'll come across it if you've studied Aristotle, and where he says basically he's arguing against an opponent who gives a purely mechanistic explanation of the growth of plants. And so he says there's a puzzle. What prevents nature creating neither for the sake of something nor for the better, but as Zeus reigns, not in order to make the crops grow, but out of necessity? For what rises up must be cooled, and what is cool becomes water to fall down. The growth results when this happens. And then he's arguing against this because he's arguing for teleology in this section of the Physics. He says, but it's impossible for this to be the way it is. For these and every natural thing come about either always or usually, but that which is by luck and by spontaneity does not. For it does not seem to be by luck or spontaneity that it rains a lot in winter, but only if it does in the summer. And if they cannot be by coincidence or spontaneity, then they are for the sake of something. So he's clearly arguing for teleology, but what he's saying, about teleology here, is highly contested. Now, the Stoicizing reading would have it that the seasons, including the rain in winter, is in order to make the crops grow so that humans can eat them. So everything is set up for our benefit. That's what they take from this passage. But you can read it in a slightly different way, where the cycle of the seasons coincidentally support life, including plant life. And then humans use agriculture to exploit that usual pattern of events, and they then use the crops in order for their own ends. So you don't need to have all of these things interconnected in the way that the Stoicizing reading wants to have it. So the humans, I mean, the point is that humans have to use the art of agriculture to make any of this work for them. It's not as if the environment's set up for them in some kind of natural way, apart from their techne, apart from their efforts. And in fact, when we look at Aristotle's works, which describe the cycle of the seasons, they're like the Meteorologica, he gives purely mechanistic explanations. He never says, oh, look, it's raining because that'll be good for the crops because then the farmers will do well. Absolutely does not explain it in that way. So there's this kind of, however, there is this kind of coordination between the cycle of the seasons and the normal development, which is helpful to plants and animals, even though it isn't, directly for the sake of supporting the plants and animals. And this is how several scholars explain that metaphysics passage. So if we go back to the metaphysics passage where it says, so everything is arranged in some way, but not in the same way. You can find that entities within the natural world for Aristotle, including this kind of the inanimate cyclical process of the seasons, is aiming in some way to imitate the prime mover. So the prime mover is pure actuality, and these other entities are attempting to there's an attempt to imitate eternal cycles. So animals do this by reproducing, because they reproduce another like in kind to themselves, and in that way they can be as eternal as possible. They try and maintain their own being, they try and maintain their own form. So that's one way to do it. And the seasons are kind of in some kind of cyclic pattern because of this. So there's a coincidence of all of these different entities aiming for that end, and then they kind of overlap in certain ways. And another something that might make us worry about the alternative reading is that Aristotle's very much aware and makes note of times when these seasonal patterns are not helpful to animals and plants. So it's just not always the case. It coincides sometimes, but not always. In fact, and even the seasons aren't that regular, so that some years are wetter and some years are drier, and this will help certain animals and certain plants. So he sort of maps that out in his zoology. So the way that István Bodner has described this is his view about sort of overlapping different ends, is that the common objective of striving generates a web of mutual interrelationships between these living beings and the cyclical cycles of the seasons. Okay, so that's to sort of deconstruct the metaphysics passage part of it, but the second part is what I'll move on to now. How is it that the whole is like a household? And here's where we need to bring in the different kinds of teleology in Aristotle. So in its most distinctive guise, what we find in the zoology, as I said, is this concentration on individual organisms. And so we identify a functional part, and we see how this is vital to the animal, and we think about the ends of that animal and how it lives out its way of life. And in doing so, though, of course, animals aren't just separated off from the rest of the world, because they need food. All animals need food, and all plants need food actually as well, but Aristotle is very much concentrated on animals. And that means that they're going to have to use the material potentials in their environment as food to sustain their life. So they're using those things, those materials in the environment for their own ends. But if they happen to eat another living being, as most living beings do, then they are, from the perspective of what's being eaten, their ends are not being they're not reaching their own ends, but these things are incidental to them. So this will make a bit more sense when I go to an example from Monty Johnson, who is explaining the. So I take this from Monty Johnson's book about Aristotle's teleology from 2005, and I think this is a really good way of explaining this passage about the household, the metaphor of the household. So what he says, he picks up on this idea of the beast and the slave having a kind of a lucky relationship to the goal of the household. So the household is actually the sort of humans. So he says a human uses chicken for meat and eggs, and the slave for labor. So the human agent uses the chicken's flesh to nourish itself. So it's making use, as I said, it's this case of making use of the materials around it for its own good. But that material aspect, from the perspective of the chicken, is just incidental to it. The chicken doesn't aim to be delicious and meaty. It's just as it thrives and grows as a chicken, its flesh happens to take on this quality. And similarly, the chicken could produce an egg, and the slave, let's bring in the slave now. The slave could be told, you've got to make me an omelet by the master. So this is this kind of person in the background who's the real beneficiary of these operations. But neither the chicken nor the slave are aiming directly to feed the master. This is why they are incidental to the goals of the agent. So, in aiming to reproduce, the chicken produces an egg, and this is used by the master. And the slave is sort of aiming to do okay and not get punished. And incidentally, the omelet is made. And then another way to sort of undercut this overarching reading of the metaphysics passages, as Monty Johnson points out, is to realize that in Aristotle there are many ways to talk about good. So what's good for one entity is not necessarily good for another. And we find this in the zoology. There are clashing objectives. And so given that, and we accept this as part of his philosophy, as part of his ethics, and as a part of his just definition of goodness, then to have some kind of overarching nature, which is good, would have no meaning. It would just be vacuous for Aristotle. He doesn't need this. He doesn't have this in his system. Okay, now turn next to the next clearing away is to look at the politics passage. So what are these interpreters of Aristotle's zoology to say about the politics passage? And as Mariska Lornason has written, it's important to recognize that Aristotle's focus here is on the existence of natural beings qua food. So going back to the point I made before, that individual organisms can't be isolated in the sense that they have to eat. So they have to exploit their environment to find something to sustain their life. This is a basic principle of life for Aristotle. It's the most basic principle of soul, is that you have to be able to digest. And in that context, then and it's sort of here I'm building on what I've already said about the chicken, which is that here we've got two senses of for the sake of at work. So when Aristotle says that animals are for the sake of humans, he's taking the perspective of the humans. So from their point of view, they are going to utilize what's available in their environment. But that doesn't mean that that thing has been set up for them to use in that way. It's not sort of directly aiming for the good of the human. It's sort of secondarily they're using what's in their environment. So there are these two senses of for the sake of, which is spelled out in various places in Aristotle. And as Wolfgang Kuhlmann explained it in this very passage in his paper of 1985, the natures of animals use so where's the quote? I don't know that I have it there. Oh yeah, the plants and beasts contain the cause of their existence in themselves, but can secondarily be made subservient to the end of procuring food, clothing, or so on for humans. So the expediency of these plants and animals is secondary. So it's not about them, it's about the service for humans. And this is not, these things are not set up for humans to benefit from them, but humans can make use of them in a secondary way. Just as an animal might have excessive earthy matter and its nature then uses that to make horns, which benefit the animal. So that its nature makes the use of this in a secondary way. So in the similar structure, that's how we are to understand this idea in the politics of plants and animals being for the sake of humans. So a good example from the physics, actually, of that idea that living beings have their own aims, quite apart from what we use them for, is the idea of a bed frame. If you stuck a bed frame in the ground, it would sprout, which indicates that the nature of the wood is really directed towards being a tree and not directed towards you sleeping on it, you using it as a bed frame. So he acknowledges that human arts have to manipulate nature, and it's good to have kind of some knowledge of the actual natural goals of the materials that you're using and the animals and plants that you're manipulating from a human point of view. For example, there's a lot of fun things in the Historia Animalium about fishermen kind of shouting at fish and seeing, how well they hear, because then they can creep along slowly before they throw in their nets if they know that these are the kind of fish that run away if you shout at them. So there's all kinds of things you need to know about nature in order to manipulate it. But on the other hand, although he knows all about that, on the other hand, there's no mention of animals being for the sake of people in Aristotle's zoology and his zoological work. So that's solely from this passage in the Politics. All right, so let's get into more of the meat of what we could mean by Aristotle's ecology. I think that the urge to sort of first of all, the urge to leave aside the politics entirely maybe should be resisted. And that's because I think we can learn something from that politics passage and from other parts of the politics about how Aristotle thinks human beings are related to other living beings and to their environment. And that is part of our story. For us who are more ecologically conscious, it's a negative part of the story, but we need to include that in our discussions as well as what comes up in the zoology, and not say that we just leave that aside. It's no import for his natural philosophy, as some people have claimed. We can acknowledge, of course, it's an anthropological work. It's a work on the polis, and only humans have a polis. And so there are a couple of things we can learn from the politics about humans' interactions with other animals. The first thing is that it seems to me that other animals use other animals. We see that all over the place in the zoology. But what you learn from the politics is how thoroughly human beings do that. What a good job they do of using other animals and using plants. They domesticate animals and they manipulate them. So this is not natural. This is a techne. This is a craft. Although Aristotle talks about some animals that are naturally tameable, there's all kinds of processes he describes to make animals do the things that humans want them to do. For example, there are these elephants that are trained to be war elephants, and it's a very long process of training. Another good example is mules and the production of mules, which requires you to mate a horse and a donkey. The horse and donkey don't want to mate, so you have to do all these things to them to make them mate. Now, the reason you do that is because donkeys are great for carrying stuff. So there's all these good human reasons to do these things. And there's this manipulation of the natural processes of animals that are very clearly set out as well. And this is also in the Historia Animalium, Aristotle's book of data on animals, on zoology. So animals can be bred in particular ways, prevented from breeding. Their reproductive products are taken away from them, eggs and milk, for example. But he does have this small little inkling of environmental sensibility in the politics, which is when he says that he strongly disapproves of humans taking more natural resources than are necessary. And he calls this greed, or sort of excessive wealth getting. So the craft of household management is to set a limit on how much you take from the environment. So that's the hint of the sustainability idea. I put it in the title, but I'm afraid that's all I have from Aristotle, at least. There are some indications that Plato is aware of problems with taking more resources from the environment than you can put back. Particularly in his Critias, he has sort of a passage about the Atlantans and what they were doing wrong. And both Aristotle and Plato think that the human population should be controlled in a certain area, perhaps because of this awareness of the limitation of resources. Although one thinks that they're also thinking anthropocentrically here. They're thinking about self-sufficiency and the flourishing of a human community. So they're thinking about human concerns. Now, as for worrying about the negative effects of humans on the environment, there's very little of this in zoology. There's actually more of it in Theophrastus, because Theophrastus was given the task of investigating plants. And he notices a lot of areas where the plants are devastated because of human activities. Aristotle mentions a couple of points in the Historia Animalium. I'm giving you one on the handout, where in certain places animals don't thrive or they don't exist at all, but he doesn't mention humans as the reason for this. He usually says, well, it's got to do with the food or the climate. And there are a couple of places where he talks about detrimental effects on domesticated animals of certain husbandry procedures. So there are these horses that are stabled, and they suffer from illnesses. They need vets, a little bit like humans. If we go back to Plato and we think of the city of pigs, and then there's the luxury city, and the humans then need doctors. Well, these poor animals, because of their lifestyle, they need doctors, they need veterinarians. And I've discerned this other strain of ideas in domesticated. So in domesticated animals, the females suffer the same kind of ailments as human women. And human women have the worst time in pregnancy, the worst time in birth, and so on, for Aristotle. And he then identifies this with dogs and horses and animals that are kind of live with us. And he says they have the same ailments. So that's a little bit about our effect, like sort of negative effect on other animals. But now I want to turn to the Historia Animalium and concentrate on the Historia Animalium and bits of the generation of animals to think about where we find interspecies, where we find something about the surroundings, both the living surroundings and the non-living surroundings of the animal. So rather than isolating the animal off, we're going to think about the background conditions for flourishing of particular animals. First, to note about the information that we get in Historia Animalium. So although I've been emphasizing that there's a lot about agriculture, about the way that humans have used animals, about how to manipulate animals, it's not that Aristotle is giving us a guide to how to catch the most fish, or how to handle our crops, or how to restrain our domesticated animals. It's not like that. He is taking the information that he can get. There's no sort of habit of collecting natural history. We don't have Darwin sending his friends out to collect samples of butterflies. And nobody's doing that at the moment. So the information that he gets, that he doesn't gather himself, or his students don't gather, he gets those from people who are concerned with animals, and those people are concerned with animals because they are making money from those animals, or they're eating those animals. So that's where his information comes from. But he disdains the knowledge that they give him in some ways, because those sort of people are interested in profit or interested in something else and catching these animals for their own ends. They're not interested in knowledge for its own sake. So they're going to get some things wrong. And I have this passage here from the Generation of Animals where he complains about the fishermen don't watch these fish copulate. They're not really gathering that information because they're not watching it carefully, because they're not interested in knowledge for its own sake. In terms of the background conditions, the sort of both the animate and inanimate conditions in which animals live, the first thing to note is that Aristotle imagines that animals sort of grow up and live in the areas that are best for them to thrive in. So he's aware of these environments, these broader environments, but he's less inclined to worry about these changing radically or animals not fitting into where they live. I mean, I suppose now we talk about environmental niches, so animals do live in sort of environments that fit their lifestyles. So one of these indications here is where he says, residents by seas and rivers and lakes include all the web-footed, for nature itself seeks what is suitable. So you get the idea of kind of the web-footed things kind of occur in the wet areas. Okay. But I'd say there were two types of environment in Aristotle, as I call one the broad environment, and then the narrower or more specific environment. So the broad kind of environment is the elements, like do they live in air, do they live in water, do they live on the land? And sometimes they combine some of these things, so you can have an animal that breeds on land and feeds in the water. So those are the kind of broad considerations of the kind of elementary background to this animal's life. It's going to affect a lot, like you can see already that the webbing is going to be something, how they breathe is going to be another thing. And then there's this more specific environment. So the example I have here is living in holes. So narrow down, like do these animals, what are they doing like on the ground? They in a hole, they live in a hole, and that will determine the shape of their bodies. So here the hole dwellers have their legs attached obliquely and stretched out on the ground so that they can crawl into these holes. Okay. So that though both of those things are going to affect the physiology, anatomy, and behavior of animals. Moving on then to our living background, so what animals and plants are around a particular living being. There seem to be, as I said, these two perspectives. There's either trying to avoid being eaten or there's trying to eat stuff. And occasionally, so there's a kind of war, kind of battle amongst the animals, and they have competing goods. And then occasionally there's cooperation where the goods of two animals overlap and they help each other, and they create a better, some environment that's better for both of them by cooperating. Now, I may not go through this in much detail, but there's some details about what animals eat, so that's something external to them, and it's another animal or plant, and those things shape their bodies. So the camel, for instance, has a mouth and stomach that's designed to digest the kinds of bushes that they live around, these thorny bushes. So they need to be crunch it up, and so it's usually that way around, that we're focusing on the ends of the animal and their body adapting to or being adapted to the food that they take in, and they usually don't have a complex relationship between predator and prey, except in this one example where it said that the sharks, the cetaceans, have a mouth that's designed to take in less food. And this is good for them because they're gluttonous, but it's sort of, in a way as well, good for the creatures that get away. And then there's another passage where he says that some animals, some fish, have to produce a lot of eggs because there are a lot of predators that like to eat these eggs. So it looks like there are these competing goals that result in a difference in their living strategies. Okay, so that's that. As I said, so we have these two sides. We have predation and we have the trying to avoid getting eaten. So there's a lot in his zoology about horns and tusks and teeth, and there's also quite a lot about how certain animals are really good at running away or hiding themselves. So that they're cephalopods that release ink, and then they can avoid predation. And there's biting and there's poison and so on. And there's also this lovely example of cooperation, where the crocodile. When crocodiles gape, the plover fly in and clean their teeth. And while they themselves are getting their food, the crocodile perceives that he is being benefited and does not harm them. So together they create a better situation. So some scholars suggest that these factors, the sort of broad and narrow environmental factors, not really talking about the interspecies stuff, but the stuff from before, you should bring it into the essence of the animal. So Aristotle talks about bioi, ways of life, that includes this sort of where they live and how they adapt to their, or how they're adapted to their environments. But some scholars think that that habitat needs to come into the description of the animal's essence, like what it is to be that animal must include all of these things outside of it. And I think that that then kind of narrows down the ecological perspective again. So we're trying to get to just a single organism as a response to that stoicizing view. So my idea is that we could have a place for ecology in Aristotle's philosophy without reducing it all into the essence of the kind. So we have some kind of place that they're best suited to, but it's not absolute. If it's not essential to them that they have that environment, because there are differences that in Historia Animalium he talks about. Some environments are slightly different, and if you get into a particularly nice environment, then the character of animals changes. So if it's very warm and there's lots of food, they become more friendly, so we don't have this warring between them anymore. So if it were in their essence, then they wouldn't be adaptable and changeable in that way. Okay, final section is just be a few minutes. His zoology, so I admit that Aristotle's zoology does emphasize the flourishing of the individual organism. And it focuses on this normal natural setting and the way it uses other material potentials in its environment to thrive. And that includes the bodies of other animals and plants. And the patterns of the seasons are generally, but not always, supportive of life. But there are still these ecological elements in Aristotle. There are clashing goals. So the predator is aiming for the good of the predator, and the prey is aiming for the good of the prey, and those things do not coincide. And there's a huge amount of manipulation by human beings, which thwart the goals of animals. So that's where I get to. But sort of two final notes. One about human beings in Aristotle's system and how that might affect animals. And the second small point is about where we get to with environmental ethics. So first of all, Aristotle thinks humans are the best animals. And he's not apologetic about that. And one of the reasons we're the best animals is that we can think about stuff. And he includes zoology in our philosophical development. So in order to think about the essences of things, we need to do zoology, we need to study animals. But in order to do that, we have to cut them up. We have to kill them and cut them up. So here we have another way that humans are going to be using animals for their own benefit, for their intellectual development. And all I can think is that we could apply the sustainability principle here too. So just as we don't want to be greedy about taking more resources than we need, the dissection of animals should probably not be greedy too. We should just dissect as many as is needed to learn about their composition for our own intellectual benefit. And the final point is about what we're going to do about environmental ethics. Well, you can find in Aristotle the idea that animals have a good of their own. And in fact, that supports the intellectual endeavor, because you're trying to find out about the truth. It's true that animals have goals and goods of their own. That's what you discover when you dissect them and when you investigate them. So in that sense, animals have a value all of their own, quite apart from the way that humans use them. And there are a few other hints that animals have goods apart from human goods. So it's not, he's not wholly anthropocentric in his position. Even in the politics passage, he says there's some wild animals that we don't have any use for. Some of them we do, but quite a lot of them we don't. You're not going to make your house out of jellyfish or starfish or something. And there are some places on the earth that are filled with living beings that we can't even see and experience. He thinks there are living beings on the moon. And so in Aristotle's zoology in particular, you can find this reverence for animal form, for the forms of living beings, and even an exuberance of the beauty and form of in living nature. And in that sense, Aristotle is showing us that there is value in, and that animals and plants have their own excellences quite apart from our perceptions of them. Okay, I'm done.
Wow, that was amazing. Thanks so much. Just a reminder, if you have any questions for Dr. Connell, please throw them into the chat on Teams. But I do have a couple to start off here. So I'm seeing, okay, so you definitely mentioned this a little bit at the end, but I was wondering if you could explain a little bit more about the actual difference between human beings and animals. For Aristotle, it seems as though they're almost in the same class in many ways. And yeah, could you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, I think that Caleb would be very good on this question, but because basically there are three main capacities of the soul, according to Aristotle's De Anima: the nutrigenerative, the sentient, and the intellectual. And no animal has this intellectual capacity. So this really sets us apart. And he goes so far in the ethics to say that, you know, leading our lives as human beings requires the operation of this intellectual capacity, so that we need to reason in order to decide to do the right things in our lives. So it guides human life in a way that it supposedly doesn't guide the lives of any animals. But you have to be careful, because I think that you can see kinds of reasoning in animals, and you can even see them reasoning towards the good ends of their lives. But the way that humans do that kind of reasoning is so different, that sets them apart. And sometimes I think, you know, it's easier for all of us to see how different human beings are from other animals. I mean, they don't live in houses like they construct, you know. There's all kinds of things that they don't wear clothes, you know. But it's kind of interesting to think where Aristotle sees overlaps between us and other living beings, and he does see some important ones, like being political. Actually, there are certain animals that are political animals, and that can and animals have friendship relationships with their young, and in other areas there are overlaps, even though human beings sort of do something entirely different because they have this intellectual capacity.
That's fascinating. Thanks so much. I guess in a little bit of a follow-up before we get to the next question. From an ethical perspective, how does this difference apply for differently to humans as being intellectual creatures and having other capacities, and using other humans, as you mentioned, from, let's say, using animals?
Oh, that's a good question. Yeah. So I don't think that Aristotle has much problem with using domesticated animals. He seems to just take it for granted that they're there for us to use, like not just domesticated animals, but wild animals as well, and wild animals that we can dissect. And so, I mean, he doesn't seem to have the kind of reverence for nature that's sometimes imputed to him. And sadly, I mean, I also think that he thinks that we can use other human beings. And the problem is, probably the most prominent example of this is slaves. And sometimes he will liken slaves to domesticated animals in certain contexts. And so in a way, and especially if this is the natural slave, then, I mean, I didn't mention it, but there was something I didn't mention it, I can't remember where it fell out of the talk, but there's one place where he says, confusingly to me, he says that being a domesticated animal is kind of better for the animal than being a wild animal. And the only thing I can think is that, well, you know, my cat has a nicer time because I give it food, and it doesn't get eaten by a tiger, and it doesn't starve to death. So there are certain sort of natural, protecting it from its kind of natural, the things that might snuff it out in its natural setting. And in that way, I suppose domesticated animals do better than wild animals. But he says something kind of similar about slaves somewhere, doesn't he? About how somehow a slave needs a master. So it's kind of the slave is doing better to have the master than to have, you know, because a slave, for Aristotle, at least a natural slave, doesn't have a operational deliberative faculty, so is not able to make the right decisions.
Really fascinating. I guess to change to a slightly different area of questioning, I have a question that reads, I wanted you to discuss a bit further the politics passage on page 6 of the handout about avoiding excessive wealth getting and greed. As I read this excerpt, it suggests that the reason for limiting our exploitation of natural resources is our own virtue. That is, any ecological sustainability results or secondary results of the pursuit of virtue. I'm hesitant to accept that putting such concerns as secondary to human virtue is really an ecological view, especially since limitation on wealth getting would apply not just to living beings and natural resources, but also to commercial practices and so forth. So could you please say some more about this?
Yeah, I can't find it now, but I know exactly. Yeah, so the passage, yes, I suppose he says, let's not, you know, let's not be greedy, but it is in the context of the, so thing is, it's not in his ethics. He doesn't say this in his ethics, which is where I would think he would if he was most concerned about the development of particular virtues. He says this in the politics when he's talking about the setup of societies, and he's thinking about in the background the, you know, the kind of physical setup of a city. Like, where are you going to plant your city? Is it going to have a port? You know, where are you going to get your trees from? And I think so. I do think that there is some kind of concern for ecology and sustainability there. I mean, I admit that it's kind of fragmentary, but I think if it was going to be anywhere, it would be in his politics. And if he was just concerned about people not being greedy, and that being a reason to say, you know, only take as much from the environment as will not make you greedy, then I think he would say something about that in his ethics. So that would be that would be just off the top of my head. I mean, I'd need to go back and look at that passage more in more detail and see if it hooked up with any discussions of greed or intemperance in the ethics. I don't think it does, but it might do. I mean, there might be similar vocabulary.
Awesome. Thanks so much. We do have another question from Dr. Coho here. I'm going to send him so y'all can see this one.
All right. So I have first a clarifying question, and then maybe a proposal that I want to get your take on. So my clarifying question was just sort of thinking, if we take Aristotle's view, like, what would an environmental review process or planning, like, let's think about what it would look like. And is this fair to say that for Aristotle, plants and animals have their own interests? So if we're deciding to about building some project, we should take into account and as something that should be part of deliberation, whether it would negatively affect the life of an animal or plant. But they're not really on a par with humans, so there'd be some kind of proportionality, but sort of heavily weighted towards human interests and goals, but without disregarding completely or treating as having no weight things for animals and plants. So if there was a similar way to do the project, but with less harm, you'd sort of be the good thing to do would be to do that, but you wouldn't cancel a project. Does that seem like a fair summary of your reading?
Yeah, that would be what Aristotle would think. Yeah, I agree with that. Yeah, it's not that. I mean, so that to me is not that helpful to undercut some of the problems that we're experiencing now with environmental degradation. It's part of the history of philosophy that this is the view, I guess that my thought at the end was more that we could do something slightly different in terms of neo-Aristotelian readings,
Right.
where we see this value as objective and in some sense, you know, and have other things around it, like realizing that we just can't go on in this way. But but I admit that Aristotle himself doesn't offer us much in
right.
a way.
So it's not so much using this as a basis, but saying there is something there. Okay, so where I want to push back on or sort of get your thoughts is here's a view, an interpretation that I sort of incline towards, where it's not so much anthropocentric specifically, but it is sort of really distinguishing between the ways of life that creatures capable of rational activity and happiness can undergo, and privileging that as opposed to these other ways of life of plants and animals. And there's an important passage that you didn't talk about in your talk, but I think would fit into this broader project, from De Caelo 2:12, where he sort of talks about the different ways that living things can achieve the good. And sort of the best way is to just get it. Some living things like humans can maybe get there with a lot of work, but then he compares it to health. There are some people who are never going to be healthy, like no matter how much work you do. And so the best thing the doctor can help them with is to sort of be a little less sick. And it looks like that's sort of the category animals and plants are in. And then if you take that view, then going back to that earlier question, the way I tend to read what Aristotle thinks of plants, domesticated plants and animals, well, and also slaves to some extent, is that they might get some advantages. So maybe the cat or dog is safer and can live their life better. But the main reason is that they can't fully attain the good on their own, but by being tools of this other form of life. And we see that what he says about the citizens in the polis who aren't so much reaching happiness but are helping others achieve happiness. So that just looks like a common strategy. And then if he has this view where there are a bunch of different ways of life that have their own good, but some of these goods are so partial and incomplete, he wants to strongly privilege the ways of life that are higher up in the hierarchy. So are you on board with that? Do you want to resist that?
Well,
as an interpretation of Aristotle, not obviously, I'm not saying you.
No. And I think that, you know, reading through Historia Animalium quite carefully with several scholars last year and looking at all the agricultural passages, and I think we all came to kind of think that this was part of his overall strategy, was that humans, but not just humans, but male humans of a certain kind, were the ones who were who were really living the good life, and that everything else is subordinate to that. So I do think that is that. I mean, ultimately, although it's messy in places, and he seems to, you know, not have that view all the time, that does seem to be the most connected kind of idea of promoting the goods in ethics and in human society.
Do you think there is an important distinction though between different species kinds, where he thinks there's no way an animal could ever achieve these goods, and some of the differences amongst humans, where in a way, you know, there are grounds in Aristotle for thinking humans all share this rational nature, and it's sort of accidents that prevent some people from achieving the good life. So do you see that as a more of a categorical distinction in one case and more circumstantial in the other, or do you think it blurs?
No, I think that would make sense. So you know, humans are the best of animals. He says that again and again in his zoological works, and he uses it as a heuristic sometimes. And so if you're a human, even if you're a slave or a woman, or if you're a slave woman, God forbid, then you know, you're a human, and you can have a human child, you know. So there are these ways in which you're kind of winning if you're a human. And then if you were born, you know, with these natural weaknesses as a human, that's unlucky in some ways, isn't it? That you've been born with the weaknesses and not the strengths. Or you've had a bad upbringing. That's also unlucky. It can be unlucky.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. What about
yeah.
And you can cut me off, Gabe, but I'm just going to keep following up a little.
Fun. I have one other question, but we've got time. Go ahead.
Let me just do one further follow up, which is whether to some extent Aristotle does just take a more species level, a more good of the whole perspective. That's much less individualist in terms of its evaluation than how we think about things. Because if you think of partly, he says in the De Anima, where he's talking about why you need to reproduce, it's so that the form of the species, of the animal or plant, can be preserved, and that has a sort of priority over the individuals. It's only in the special case of these heavenly bodies he thinks are eternal, they sort of have their own individual good. But for, I think, to some extent, not just for plants and animals, but even for us humans, he thinks it's more that the human way of life goes on and continues. That's what's valuable more than even the most privileged of humans for Aristotle, much less women or slaves.
Yeah, but you see, there is no abstract form that's doing the continuing. So every single individual has that. That's the point, is that you need living beings. You need living beings around which have these forms. And in that sense, those two are combined in some way.
You really need the particular individuals, unlike with the Platonic forms, but you don't need this individual, maybe. So in that sense, I think it's a little different than the way more contemporary approaches.
Yeah.
Thanks so much. So this will be the last question for today. If you all would like to reference this in the future, you can follow us on YouTube and any of our social media platforms. You can find links to those at dphi.org. Last question, why should we continue to study thinkers whose scientific or ethical perspectives are incorrect or out of date, or why do you?
Yeah, thank you very much. Well, it's really important to know the origins of the ideas that are still hanging around and have their threads in our lives today. If we don't study them in detail and take them apart, look at the arguments, look at why people had these perspectives and why they continue to, then we're ignorant and we don't know what's happening to us. So I believe that we need to study these, especially somebody like Aristotle, who's hugely influential in the history of Western thought. He's just got you find him everywhere. I just went to this conference that was about medieval philosophy, and Aristotle was just everywhere. And so if you know about and you're able to interpret these passages and you know what they mean, then you've got power. You can understand these thought patterns, which is a huge benefit, I believe.
Right. Thanks so much. I'm sure you get a round of applause if we were not digital. So thanks, everyone. You have a great day.
Okay.
Thank you.